Each day, the world's most powerful nation relies on more than 160 individuals at posts around the world, in places where there is trouble, in places where there is opportunity. They are there to represent the values of the United States of America. Their work takes them to places where America is respected by some and hated by others. They have a title that carries both honor and jeopardy. They are America's ambassadors. My guest today has served as our nation's ambassador to 4 countries: Macedonia, Poland, South Korea, and Iraq. He's dealt with some of the world's most tyrannical governments like North Korea. He's also helped bring peace, as he did in 1995 when he helped negotiate the Dayton Peace Agreement, which ended the war in Bosnia and brought peace which has lasted to this day. His 30-plus years as one of America's top diplomats is chronicled in his memoir, Outpost, Life on the Frontlines of American Diplomacy, and it is a pleasure to welcome him here to the Free Speech Zone, Ambassador Christopher Hill.
You are now entering the Free Speech Zone. Here's your host, Eric Barnard.
All right, so we're here with former Ambassador Christopher Hill. He's joining us here via phone. Mr. Ambassador, once again, welcome to the show. Really looking forward to this conversation. So my first question to you, as a former ambassador, there's a lot of interesting foreign policy events and foreign affairs taking place right now. What do you make of this election going on right now in Israel between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former Army chief, Mr. Gantz? What do you think about this election?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. Looking forward to this. We'll, I think, be able to cover a lot of ground in the time we have.
My pleasure.
I would say these Israeli elections are very interesting for a couple of reasons. One, Bibi Netanyahu looks like, and I think you have to be a little careful on what the outcome will be, but it looks like he will not manage to get a second term out of this. And if he's not the prime minister, some of these corruption charges that he's up against may actually go forward. So for him, it's quite a personal situation. But I think for the country, it also kind of speaks volumes about the possible new direction that Israel will be going in. The idea, of course, is for this new government also to have a lot of parties involved, but the whole concept of it is to rule from the center. So we may see some real changes in how the Israelis look at things, how the Israelis kind of line up in some of these regional issues. Certainly one thing that I think Americans learned from the Arab Spring a few years ago is that this is not all about Israel. There are a lot of other things going on in the region. And I think we might see some changes in how Israel conducts itself.
Absolutely. This is going to certainly lead to a different Israel, whether Prime Minister Netanyahu does manage to somehow win a majority and stay in, or if he does ultimately lose, and then he's going to have to deal with his these corruption charges that he's now had levied against him. And you put your finger right there on another point about the other issues going on in the region. The other big news this week was this attack on the Saudi oil tankers that Iran has been blamed for. What do you make of this hostility that Iran has made towards the Saudi kingdom?
Well, to be sure, this didn't just start last week. These two countries have been kind of going at it for quite a while. I think it really dates back decades. Maybe it's better to describe as centuries. But certainly when the U.S. Went into Iraq and essentially flipped Iraq from being a Sunni-led country to a Shia-led country, this was of great concern to the Saudis because they saw a kind of natural Arab ally emerging for Iran. And so I think from the Saudi point of view, they looked at their northern frontier and saw a lot more Shia presence. And for the Saudis, it's also very important because they have their own Shia population in what's called the East Province, which, by the way, happens to be the place where much of their oil is produced. So they were very concerned about all the developments in Iraq, and combined with this kind of very hardline Islamicist government in Tehran. So the Saudis have been viewing this with alarm. They were not happy with the the George W. Bush administration for kind of plunging into Iraq, and they were not happy, of course, with the Obama administration for not only kind of staying the course in Iraq, but also trying to work with the Iranians on a deal along with the European and Chinese and Russian partners. So the Saudis kind of looked at this and were very worried. Along comes President Trump and tells the Saudis not to worry. We're behind you. We're going to stick with you, and we're going to share your views on the dangers of Iran. And of course, one of the major foreign policy initiatives of the Trump administration was to pull the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA. So that has certainly kind of raised the bar here. The Iranians are, they have not responded by saying, gee, can we talk? Maybe we can make a better deal for you. Their reaction is, you want to start this dance? We're quite willing to go through with it. And so the big question in the last week, of course, is where did this rocket attack or cruise missile attack or whatever the delivery of the ordnance come from? And I think most people believe, and certainly I think the U.S. intelligence believes, that this is probably, if not directly from Iran territory, certainly Iranian inspired. So how does the U.S. react to it? Well, when you look at these kinds of attacks, I mean, a logical thing might be to go attack Iran's own oil reserves. But I think there's a lot of concern, including in President Trump's own office, that if you attack their oil reserves, you might be setting ourselves up for a huge rise in oil prices, and for the consequence that might accelerate the possibility of a looming recession, a recession that would come during the year of American elections. So I think the president has been kind of reluctant to do this, but in foreign policy, you can't just do nothing. So I think they're looking at other options, and I suspect some of those options might include the idea that the U.S. should be buttressing its relationship with Saudi Arabia, maybe funding more Saudi military. I mean, that was pretty shocking that they couldn't protect their oil industry from this kind of attack, despite having the third largest military budget in the world. So I think we can look for more American military involvement with the Saudis, and probably more political involvement. Secretary Pompeo has already gone there. We could probably look for that. My own guess is that the Trump administration would like to avoid a kind of kinetic response.
Sure. With Secretary Pompeo already being there in the region and saying that this action by Iran is an act of war, that's a kind of a dangerous talking point for the U.S. Secretary of State to be having, because we certainly don't need to be getting drawn into any serious military conflicts. We're already engaged in that part of the world pretty heavily, and this would, like you said, this could lead to triggering a recession, a spike in the oil market, which is going to hurt more than just the United States and the Saudis and the Iranians, but. So what would your advice be to the Secretary of State and to the President and how to deal with this? Because like you said, you can't just sit back and sit on your hands and do nothing and say, well, that's their issue. Y'all work it out.
I think I agree with you. I thought it was rather surprising that the Secretary of State went to the region and used a talking point that I can understand the Saudis using, but I think we ought to be maybe a little more careful with our words, because that talking point leads to a course of action. So again, I think what the U.S. view should be, and what our what our statements should be, are to kind of emphasize our longstanding relationship with the Saudis, our desire to step that up, to do more to help Saudi Arabia against this threat from Iran, and to avoid terms that would suggest another move, which would be some kind of kinetic response. I was surprised. First of all, I don't think it's really in the Secretary of State's lane to be talking, using words like war. But on the other hand, this is the Trump administration, and who knows who's going to say what.
You're right there. You never know what's going to be said, or rather what's going to be tweeted when it comes to this administration. But you say that using words like war really isn't something that is really in the lane of the Secretary of State. What do you make of Secretary of State Pompeo? This is not someone who's been a diplomat. This is a politician and a former military officer. So he's a little unconditional for this kind of job. What do you think of him?
Well, I think it's a complex question. Certainly, he graduated from West Point. Apparently, he was number one in his class. Mm-hmm. But then again, he didn't get very far in the military. I think he was a captain. He left as soon as he could as a captain. He had classmates who went on to be 4-star generals. So he certainly knows the military. Has been close to the military. In fact, his language, he uses terms like mission sets and things like that, very much kind of military jargon. So I think he's very comfortable talking military. He also had a year in the CIA, and I think that's a real eye-opening experience where you see really how the sausage is made in the kitchen.
Oh, boy.
But I think then he comes over to the State Department, and I think the lesson from his predecessor, that is Secretary Tillerson, is don't let too much daylight develop between you and the president. So Pompeo, one of his strengths in office has been being very close to the president, and I think it was an open secret that he and former National Security Advisor Bolton were not on speaking terms. And were quite in a kind of bad way with each other. So one hopes that with Robert O'Brien, the new National Security Advisor, should be someone who does a more traditional role with the president, kind of laying out options, honestly explaining the different views, whether in the Pentagon or in the State Department. And one senses from O'Brien that he will have a closer relationship with Pompeo than Bolton ever had or ever wanted to have. So it suggests that we're going to have a quieter sort of and maybe more effective foreign policy team. But certainly, as we discussed a few moments ago, it was kind of unusual to see Pompeo using words like act of war, because that kind of suggests that there needs to be some kind of warlike response to this. So I think Pompeo is kind of compared to Bolton, he was actually quite kind of civil and sane in his pronouncements, but that was a very strong one and, frankly, a rather interesting one.
It definitely was, and you had over 3 decades of experience of working for the State Department, working overseas. You worked for multiple Secretaries of State and multiple administrations. What's your assessment of what makes a sound Secretary of State, and is a person that's more suited for that job than say another person?
Well, I worked for 12 Secretaries of State in 6 different administrations. And I think one of the key things, a couple of things. One, the secretary has to have a good relationship with the president. When a secretary has a good relationship with the president, that just works a lot better than when the State Department is somehow at odds with the president. So Pompeo certainly gets high marks on that. But the other thing that a secretary needs to do is to not get out ahead of the president, any president. Now, if a president wants to talk about act of war, that's really for the president as commander-in-chief. He can do that. So I think Pompeo has tried to stay in step with the president, which is a good thing. But occasionally, as we saw, this week, he's maybe gone out a little, out on his skis in that regard. But, overall, I think Pompeo has tried to kind of lift up the State Department's reputation, shown that it's an effective and hard-nosed department in the U.S. government, that they're not a bunch of striped pants wimps or something, which is often a criticism you get. And by the way, having spent 30 years there, I think it's very unfair. But
sure.
I think Secretary Pompeo is trying to show that it's a tough-minded State Department, and the president can rely on it.
And he's got his work cut out for him, especially when you have people that do give those kind of criticisms to the State Department. And I imagine that's sort of that's like a thorn in your side to think. It's like, someone who's never worked there, and certainly someone who's not spent 3 decades working for the State Department, knows American diplomacy. I imagine you might want to take that personally. It's like, me, I came out of the military, and when people who have never served, try to tell me, what's wrong with the military and what's right with it, I'm like, what do you know?
You got it. You got it. It is really annoying. I mean, I used to deal with the North Koreans. I did that for several years under George W. Bush. And, it's not like you're negotiating with air. You're negotiating with another side that basically doesn't agree with anything you're saying. So you're trying to, get some other countries to come in and kind of attack their flanks. And you're trying to kind of work this stuff. And then you go back to Washington, and then some person who knows nothing, and that's being kind, says, well, why didn't you push this? Why didn't you push that? As if they think that I was sitting there kind of giving in to North Korean.
Yeah, you were the one being talked down to. They were telling you what they wanted. You were just there.
That's right. And it is kind of extraordinary in America today, the notion that somehow we are victims in the world, that somehow the UN is there to hold us down, or the World Bank is there to, tell us what to do, or any number of the panoply of these international organizations are there to somehow constrain America. And frankly, if you look at the history of these organizations, we created them. And we didn't create them. We didn't create them to put limits on ourselves. We created them to extend our capacities to get our way in things. And so it is just astounding to me to hear so many Americans say, well, we got to get out of the UN. They're really, cramping our style. People simply don't know what they're talking about when they make statements like that. And I think as a general rule of thumb in America these days, people ought to kind of tally up whether they're listening a little more than they're broadcasting. And I think if you listen more than you speak, you're probably learning something.
Yeah, the old saying, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Yeah. And that's so you can listen more than you speak. But you're right, very few people, listen today. Listening is something that nobody does. Republicans don't listen to Democrats. Democrats don't listen to Republicans. The media doesn't listen to anybody, and the people don't want to hear anything from anyone. And that's very, very, very sad in this day and age, because that's how you're going to hammer out differences. Is you're going to have to talk, and most important, you're going to have to listen, because that's how you're going to understand, how you're going to come to some sort of compromise or an agreement to get anything done. Imagine if we were having these negotiations with the Soviet Union back in the day, if President Nixon or Secretary of State Kissinger and having their talks with both the Soviet Union, China, and of course Vietnam, and they had basically said, you're going to give us whatever we want, and then we're not going to listen to any of your demands or anything you agree with. You wouldn't have had a strategic arms limitation treaty. You wouldn't have had, triangular diplomacy. You wouldn't have had, opening up relations with China, and all that allowed for. You would essentially be kind of, the Cold War would still be going on, perhaps, probably would have escalated.
You got it. And, there used to be kind of a quaint notion that, when people are overseas dealing with foreign countries, the country should try to rally around them, whether it's the president off there or the Secretary of State. There ought to be some notion of, that we are one country speaking with one voice. But now foreign policy is just another, bloody battlefield for American domestic politics. And so it never seems to end. And so I think it's a big problem, because I think it makes us look divided and weak. So for all the criticism one gets when one is overseas, people who think they're being really tough, well, they're not. They're just creating an impression of division and weakness.
Right.
So I hope as a country we can maybe come together on some issues of consensus, especially in the foreign arena, and try to do better as a country to speak with a single and therefore a stronger voice.
Yeah, I certainly would. I certainly would hope for that myself. Because when you were an ambassador, and you've been an ambassador 4 times, and like you said, working for 12 different secretaries of state and 6 different presidential administrations, what did you see with how we were treated with other countries? Were they more respectful? Were they more fearful? Were they more willing to work with us because we sort of did speak with one voice in that aspect back then?
Back then is not so long ago, and it still goes on in a number of countries today. But I think when American diplomats speak, people want to hear. People want to listen. And I think we've always been considered, the country that when we speak. I mean, I've been at meetings when I would start speaking, there would be this hush in the room because people want to know what the American is thinking. So I think we've been pretty good at it. I think we've been pretty effective at not having some old prejudices come in. I mean, dealing in the Balkans, for example, some of our European partners were assumed by the Balkan countries to have old prejudices, whether it was the French somehow liked the Serbs and the Germans somehow liked the Croats. Sometimes it wasn't fair to the French or the Germans to characterize their views like that, but no one ever felt that we were doing that. I think the problem has come up maybe after the Cold War, where everything took on, for a time at least, a note of less seriousness than during the Cold War. And then before you knew it, we felt, so many Americans felt we were sort of secular missionaries going out there to wag our finger at countries and tell them to be more like us and things like that. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think our listeners got a little less interested in listening. So again, I think we need to kind of tighten up our lines and figure out what it is we want country X to do, and not expect country X to be exactly like us, but certainly make it clear to people in country X that, look, our relationship is going to depend on certain better behavior. We'll work with them on that, but I don't think we need to be, scolding people publicly. In diplomacy, you can be much more effective if people trust you to not try to show them up. I don't care if you're a batter at a baseball game and you don't show up the umpire, and I mean, there are things you need to do more quietly, and I think the U.S. needs to relearn that lesson, because frankly, we've been pretty good at it over the years.
Yeah, they'll go back to the old Teddy Roosevelt mantra, speak softly but carry a big stick. And I think that if people remember that, it's like, we're the United States of America. We have the strongest military. We can certainly, if it's in our policy to attack or to defend, we have that at our disposal. So I mean, most countries, probably remember that fact. But let's talk about, country X. We try to want them to be more like us, or so to speak, and that's sort of where we've sort of gone down this road post Cold War. Let's talk with North Korea, because you alluded to that earlier, and I really wanted to ask you about that, because you look at what's been going on now with President Trump and with President Moon in South Korea, and this sort of negotiation between these three states. What do you make of this negotiation with North Korea? And are we? I don't see the president, sort of wagging his finger at the North Koreans, saying, "Be more like us, give more freedom, let people criticize you." You don't see that. You don't see that going on. But you also don't see. You also don't see. You don't see too many people really criticizing the president on the right for talking to the North Koreans. You hear it from the left, saying, "How dare he, legitimize someone like Kim Jong-un."
Yeah, I'm always believe in talking to someone else. I think you need some dialogue track. I mean, if you're going to make any progress, you're going to do it by some sort of process of negotiation. By the way, I think it's been very important to the South Koreans that the U.S. look like it's prepared to listen and prepared to kind of reach a deal. I mean, the South Koreans, after all, are the ones who live on the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
I mean, they're the ones who can, in some cases, almost literally see North Korea from their bedroom window. And so for people, based in Washington, D.C., and, hurling threats and whatever toward North Korea, and the South Koreans say, "Hey, that's easy for you, thousands of miles away, to be saying that stuff, but we live here."
Right.
So I think it has been important to have a process of dialogue. What I worry about, and I don't mean to sound too critical here of President Trump, but there is an element of sort of a reality TV that I don't think is particularly helpful. I would have kind of insisted from the North Koreans a seriousness of purpose with respect to working level talks.
Right.
Rather than just talk about the next time the president's going to talk to them. I mean, I don't think, there are a lot of good nuclear negotiators in the U.S., but usually you don't want your president being the nuclear negotiator.
No.
For a lot of reasons. So I think the president sort of took the view that this is all about him, and therefore,
I'm the president that sat down with the North Korean leader. I'm the one that brought him to the table. So this is what I did. Look at me.
Yeah. So this, when you're president, I can only imagine the ego that must go into a job like that. But I think a president needs to understand that foreign policy is a team sport, and you can get things done better when you have a team. So I worry a lot, actually, about what message the North Koreans think they're getting from this president. And in particular, it seems that the president has kind of set up the following, which is to say, okay, North Koreans, I don't expect you to denuclearize, but if you can just hold off on some testing of weapons and missiles, we won't have exercises with the South Koreans.
Okay.
Well, I think that deal has always been available, but I think most American negotiators, including myself, didn't feel that was a deal that we wanted to take. After all, we don't have troops over in South Korea to, play volleyball with the South Korean troops. They're supposed to be there. They're supposed to be ready in the event that the North Koreans again, because they've done it before.
And the only way they're going to be, and the only way they're going to be ready is you're going to have to do exercises. That's part of being in the military, whether you're stateside or overseas. You have to do exercise.
You got to do it. Now, I think, maybe at a certain critical moment, you can postpone something or leave an exercise out. I leave that up to military planners to determine what exercises are crucial and which ones you might play around with. But I must say, when this came up, on my watch, I told the North Koreans I have but one regret about exercises, and that is we didn't have them in the spring of 1950. And once the interpreter got through with that, we didn't have any further discussion on that point. But this president, got up in Singapore, whenever it was, 15 months ago, and said, I don't like these exercises. They're very expensive. Well, I would like to inform the president that an exercise is pretty cheap compared to a war.
Oh, yeah.
And when the president also said, I'd like to bring our troops home, I think that was exactly what the North Koreans wanted to hear, because, I have never bought the argument that somehow they need nuclear weapons to protect against an American invasion. We have no interest, no desire whatsoever to invade North Korea, and they know it. What they want is to have nuclear weapons to create a circumstance where some future American president decides it's a little too dangerous to put U.S. troops there shoulder to shoulder with our South Korean allies. So I think that's what they're looking for, to somehow decouple us from South Korea and eventually from Northeast Asia. So that is something that I think we need to avoid. And yet it's something the president, I think, unwittingly perhaps, has encouraged by making statements like, I'd like to bring all our troops home.
Right. And that's an interesting point. You very rarely hear anybody discuss that. If the United States were, and I know this is a big hypothetical, and I know that, the best way not to get in trouble is never to answer hypotheticals, but I hope you'll indulge me with this question. If the United States were to leave the Korean Peninsula and was to leave Japan, have really no footprint in that area of the world, do you think that North Korea would invade South Korea? And do you think South Korea would just be defeated? Because, let's face it, South Korea's got a stronger economy. They got better fed soldiers. They've got better technology. They've got technology we've given them and trained them on. Yeah. Do you think North Korea would really stand that much of a chance? And would anyone back North Korea, or would North Korea go at it alone with their their Juche philosophy? And for those of you who don't know what Juche means, it basically means up yours to the world.
Yeah, Juche, the concept is it's self-determination, doing everything's by themselves. But like most North Korean things, it's an untruth because they rely on a lot of things from China and Russia and elsewhere. My own view, and it is a hypothetical question, and diplomats don't like to answer those, but former diplomats should indulge in those things. I think what they would like is to create a circumstance where we leave. And then, so your question is a good one. I mean, the South Korean army, the ROK army, is one of the strongest armies in the world. They're much stronger than a lot of our NATO allies. Very capable armies. They've got air forces consisting of some of our most modern high-performance strike aircraft. If you laid this out on paper, if you did a war game of this with South Korean forces pit against North Korean, I'm sure the South Koreans would win all the time. So logically speaking, why would the North Koreans even think that they have a chance against this extremely well-equipped, well-motivated, and well-fed army?
Because Kim Jong-un said so.
Yeah, I mean, the history books are full of stories of countries with less capabilities, less technology, but who nonetheless feel they're stronger because they somehow have more will. And in fact, if you look at the history of battles throughout the world, tactics and strategy, of course, is important, but also so is will and your capacity to say, we got to win this. And I think there's more will on the part of the South Koreans, but if you're a North Korean, you tend to, over time, start believing your own propaganda. And you might think that, no, we can
that's
do
all you
this.
hear.
Yeah, that's all you hear. And we've done this before. Actually, they haven't done much of anything before. But what they did lose in 1950, in the summer of 1950, was that when American troops were there, and then we brought in more American troops, and we hit them simultaneously from what was called the Pusan perimeter down in the southeast. We broke out of that. At the same time, we attacked from Incheon at something called an Incheon landing.
Right.
And so if you're a North Korean, you say, well, the recipe for having a different result here is to get the U.S. troops out of here. And so I just think it would be destabilizing to have U.S. troops out of there. And by the way, we might therefore have them out of Japan. I mean, would Japan want to be the only country in Asia to be hosting U.S. troops? And I think would be kind of sending a very dark signal to our other partners and allies around the world who kind of depend on presence. You know, it's one thing to say, hey, I'll come over and help you if you need help. It's another thing to be there.
Yeah.
And I think being there is a lot more important than, sending a nice postcard.
Yeah,
so,
and it takes less time if you have to respond because you're already there.
That's right. That's right. So I think it's important that we are there. Now, President Trump and others have said, oh, how can we afford that? Well, the answer is the South Koreans pay for a lot of our maintenance there, a lot of our maintenance. So the idea that somehow we're paying extraordinary amounts of money, they are not freeloading. They have a very serious military of their own. There's a new American base down in Pyeongtaek. We've moved it out of the center of Seoul down to kind of just west of Osan Air Base. And that base has largely been paid for by the South Koreans. So this is not something where people should be saying, well, we're paying so much money to stay there. Why are we doing that? They should be doing this themselves. I mean, it is, I think, in our security interests that we're there.
Right.
And by the way, not just security interests. I think we have a lot of interests in Asia.
We have economic, we have diplomatic, we have trade, we have, I mean, there's no one reason why we're anywhere. There's a lot more that goes into it. It's never as superficial as somebody might want to make it sound on, social media or talk radio in this day and age. But staying on Korea for a moment, what did you think when Ambassador Mark Lippert, was attacked in South Korea and by that madman that went over there and cut him across the face with that butcher knife? What did you think about that? And and why did that guy get that close? I mean, don't ambassadors get like Secret Service almost like protection all the time, especially in places like that?
Well, Korea is a very safe environment, extremely safe environment when you move around Seoul as a U.S. ambassador. So you usually do have a security guy, but, it's not like I had in Iraq where I had, a score of security guys around me.
Oh yeah.
So usually I have one guy who kind of helps you to your table. In Mark's case, it was a breakfast. I've been to a million of those breakfasts in South Korea.
I'm sure.
And the last thing I would have thought was that someone got in there with whatever it was, a knife, and would have such intent against the U.S. ambassador. I'm sure there's some different procedures. I'm sure there's more metal detectors, things like that. I guess the question of things like that, whether it's Mark Lippert's terrible experience, but also Chris Stevens' experience.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that too.
Benghazi. Well, I think like a lot of things, you have to measure risk. You have to think about risk. I mean, when I was in Baghdad, I'd say to my security guy, hey, Derek, I want to go down to Basra next Tuesday. There's an opening of a hospital, and I want to do this and that, and then we can overnight there and do more things the next day. And Derek would say, he'd always say, great idea, Mr. Ambassador. And then he would explain the complexity and the cost of doing overnights and what has to be done. And usually we'd end up agreeing that, okay, why don't we therefore get down there early in the morning, do as much as we could do, get back in the evening, and if we still have more to do, we could go again the next day. So these are kind of risks that you assess. And there's no such thing as risk-free when you're out at these places. I mean, I was in Nasiriyah, a tiny little town, not of any great importance, and our motorcade, we were attacked with an improvised explosive device. Fortunately, it was a cell phone device, and it went off in front of my car rather than under my car. It's tough. I mean, I remember someone saying, well, didn't you get your route clearance guys to clear the route? Which, you do have people who go ahead and make sure the route is clear.
Yeah, but then they come back. But then, after they go by, somebody knows if somebody's been preparing for this, they're like, okay, they swept the road, now put it in. Put it in the day of.
You got it. I don't know if it was trash
guys aren't
collection
stupid.
day or what. Yeah, it was. You will never get rid of risk. You will try to deal with risk, manage risk, but there'll always be risk there. And I think, Mark, I think made the right call to be at that breakfast, but maybe in the future they could look at more metal detectors. I'm sure that's something that they did. But again, when you're overseas, these are not risk-free environments, and no American should think that our diplomats go into completely risk-free environments in places like that. We don't.
Sure. I mean, and the same goes with people that are brought over here. Like when you saw the Saudi ambassador, back to Saudi Arabia and Iran, when Iran threatened to blow up the restaurant that the Saudi ambassador was going to go to in Washington, and talk about a really really bad decision. But again, no place is like you said. There's no place that's risk free, nowhere. Yeah. Only in somebody's imagination. But it is important for to keep ambassadors safe, and you a 4-time ambassador, and you were sent to you weren't in places that were pretty safe and pretty low risk. You were in, like you said, Iraq, Poland, Macedonia, South Korea. Did you ever worry about your safety, or you just told me about the IED going off in Iraq, but and was there any time where you were made you think okay, maybe I need to get out of here and stop doing this. This is too dangerous.
Yeah, it's kind of complex, though. I think anyone, and I think many people in the service, the military services, has this experience. You go through something, someone's fired something at you. I remember we were in Kosovo. We're heading into this kind of Indian country, whatever, and someone got hit our bumpers several times, and we were all okay, but we were fine at the time. And then at night you go, what was I doing there? Was that really worthwhile? So you do often have these second thoughts about your safety. I mean, one time in Macedonia, our embassy got attacked, and they burned all our cars and knocked down our fences and took our flagpole and tried to poke their way, sort of a medieval battering ram style on our, and they were not successful. And I remember it was, unfortunately, it wasn't a take your daughter to work day, but I happened to have my 11-year-old daughter with me in the embassy when it happened. So yeah, you kind of wonder.
That's got to be terrifying right there. You got your daughter.
what am I doing? You know, and then of course you get, you know, people go, "Whoa, couldn't they have anticipated this?" No, there are some things you're not going to anticipate. So again, I just think people need to understand these are not risk-free environments. Yes, you do all you can do. You try to make sure that you're buttoned up as well as you can be. You try to anticipate things. You try to have procedures, emergency action plans that kind of seamlessly go into effect, that everyone understands what he or she's supposed to do. But you're still going to have these issues. And I don't think the answer is to bring everyone home and put up a wall around us. I think the issue is to manage things and do the best you can.
No, absolutely, and it takes a lot of work to kind of get these things resolved. But when you, like you said, you underwent, you saw attacks in Macedonia, you saw attacks in Iraq. You know, your daughter witnessed these horrible things, and of course, we all remember, you know, when the Iranians, you know, overtook our embassy in the at the end of the 70s and took 52 Americans hostage. And of course, you know, we just had the terrible event in Libya where we lost Ambassador Hill.
Ambassador Stevens.
Excuse me. I'm like, no, I'm talking to Ambassador Hill. It's like, sorry about that. But
I'm alive and well.
You are alive and well. But Ambassador Stevens at Benghazi. What do you make of when these events happen? These get turned into, you know, a political albatross that the other side tries to hang around the incumbent president or the incumbent Secretary of State. It seems very unfair to do. And do you think that's like politicizing the dead and really weakens America rather than we don't need to be?
Yes, I do. And here I'm going to just speak as John Q. citizen. I mean, look, one can argue whether one likes Hillary Clinton or doesn't like Hillary Clinton or whatever. But the issue of Benghazi, the decisions, all of that, you know, when you're ambassador, the country that you're accredited to is your peanut stand. And, you know, you need to make decisions about how to manage the risk that we've been talking about and to make sure that you're present and do what you need to do your job. And of course, there are always issues where, you know, you've asked for some, you know, motion detector in the back of the embassy and someone says, oh, well, we could only do that at the, you know, when the new fiscal year begins. And, you know, you have these to and fro's and it's frustrating, but you try to make sure your embassy is as buttoned down as possible. But to turn that whole thing into a political spectacle, and I'm sorry to say now Secretary, then Congressman Pompeo was just blasting away at the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, as if she's the security officer for, you know, the U.S. office in Benghazi. Was just, I'm sorry, I just felt as an American
she was the only one that was ever brought forth to testify about the whole thing. She was the only one. They never brought anybody else. No, they didn't bring the director of the Diplomatic Security Bureau. They didn't bring, you know, anybody from the CIA other than the eyewitnesses that were there on the ground, and they even politicized that. The only person they brought there was Hillary Clinton.
You got it. And I just felt as an American citizen, look, I mean, I knew Chris Stevens. It was a horrific thing that happened. It is.
God rest his soul.
Exactly. He was a brave man who was, you know, so courageous and so dedicated to his work. And to see that turned into this political, you know, reality TV just was too much for me to watch. I must say, I think she was on for 11 hours, and I watched a couple of minutes of it, and I just couldn't stand it.
Yeah, and that's the way I felt, you know. And again, this was me as a citizen. I was in the military at the time, but I was sitting there and I was like, you know, this is how polarized we have gotten to where everything, you know, anything that happens is automatically the other side's fault or the incumbent's fault. And it's like, well, you should have known. I said, well, you're not the one that sat in the chair and been strafed. You're not the expert. And then, you know, when you turn the table and say, well, we requested more money, you all said no, y'all control the money. And they say, you guys still should have made do with what we gave you. And it's, once again, it's those people, like you were saying, the people in Washington, they can say what they want because they're not the ones there on the ground. They're not the ones looking over at the North Koreans across the DMZ. They're not the ones that are getting rocketed in Tripoli or in Benghazi. And it's really just, it's so screwed up. I mean, not to mince words. It's it is so screwed up.
Yeah, I have no problems with accountability. I remember after our embassy got sacked in Skopje, Macedonia, the person calls me from the bureau and says, "Okay, we're launching an accountability review." I said, "Terrific, there, friend. Let me tell you, we're all okay." And then we kind of went through what our procedures were.
They didn't. That was the first thing. We're going to do an accountability review. They didn't call, say, "You okay? Your daughter all right?" They didn't do that.
Right. Yeah, they forgot that part.
Talk about being set. Talk about the difference in worlds right there. Talk about what 3,000 miles does to you, or 30,000 miles.
You got it. Which is why, I think militaries have done this for centuries. You defer to the person on the spot, but part of the downside of sort of instantaneous communications is everyone back in Washington think that they're on the spot too, and they're not. They're not. So.
Yeah, and maybe and then it's also something the public needs to understand. It's like, don't expect them to have an answer, every time something happens. Let them actually get the facts first, so we don't get anything wrong. Because, if we, think about if we had done that in World War II, we could have think about some of the mistakes that could have been made that could have cost us the war, and we'd probably be speaking German right now. Yeah. But once again, it's people not having that grasp of history and people being so polarized. For I don't know any other word to use.
Right.
But let's move on to some other interesting issues that have been going on, because when you're picked to be an ambassador, and you've been an ambassador 4 times, talk to me about being the difference between an ambassador who's a career foreign service officer like yourself and someone who's a political appointee. Talk to me about the difference. Can those political appointees be successful ambassadors? Or do a career foreign force officer make better?
Some political appointees have been very successful ambassadors. I mean, they're successful in their private lives. They, know about leadership. They know about delegating tasks. They know about backing up your people. They know about running organizations, and they can be very successful. So I'm not going to be one of these foreign service officers who says that everyone's got to have taken the foreign service exam. I mean, I understand there are different routes to leadership in the foreign service, but I'm increasingly concerned that they are kind of losing track of the fact that political appointees, fine, but they shouldn't be taking over the whole foreign service.
Right. You should still have some career ambassadors in some of these positions.
Yeah. And I fear to some extent it's a function of the fact that we don't have any kind of constraints on campaign financing. I mean, there's some, but these campaigns, these presidential campaigns, are every year they set records in terms of how much they cost.
Yeah.
And of course, people give money, and people give money for a reason. They expect to be named to something. And I'm just sorry to see ambassadorships kind of up there on the chopping block for as something everyone wants to do. It's a pretty serious job.
Yeah, you're making an ambassadorship. You're making that sort of a consolation prize. It's like, who can buy it?
Yeah. So I think as a country, we need to be a little careful about this campaign financing, such that we don't create a situation where, the government is basically having a yard sale every 4 years and say, okay, would you like this position? Oh, you're not interested in that one? We'll try another one. And
right.
I think it's increasingly problematic. And I think there are cases of political appointees who have absolutely no idea what they're doing.
Sure.
And worse yet, don't even know it. Now, you hear people say, oh, but aren't there foreign service people assigned? I mean, wouldn't there be a good deputy chief of mission? Well, yes, in some cases, a wise political appointee will say, look, it's not really my game to be running this embassy, so I'm going to ask you, my deputy, to do that, and you have a lot of experience at it. But, sometimes these guys come and don't necessarily have, a small ego, and they'll say, wait a minute, I'm not going to defer to you. I'm in charge here. And before you know it, you'll get ambassadors who...
Yeah, you see my door, you see what it says? It says ambassador. It means it's mine.
Yeah. So, I mean, a deputy needs to tread very carefully in not appearing to say to the ambassador, hey, you really don't know this, so let me do it.
Yeah, I can end your career.
Yeah. Yes, you got it. So it's a complicated thing, and I just feel that no other country does anything like what we do in terms of selling off these ambassadorships, and I think we need to kind of rethink a little of that.
Right. And what did you? What did you think? And you don't have to answer. You don't. And if there's any question I ask you that you don't want to answer, feel free not to. But what did you think when you saw President Obama appoint Dan Rooney, the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, ambassador to Ireland, and then President Trump sort of following with putting in Woody Johnson, the owner of the Jets, at the United Kingdom? The United Kingdom and the Ireland are two critical European allies.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to speak of them personally. I don't know them personally, but yes, you do wonder how running a pro football franchise is the same as running an embassy, and or you wonder what could be taken from running a pro football franchise to help you run an embassy. I can imagine they have to deal with a lot of different problems running a football franchise, but yes, it does. It is worrisome. I see a lot of this kind of stuff, and for example, I see a lot of political appointees who feel they ought to be, yelling from the rooftops, whether it's by Twitter or whatever. And what is your job as ambassador? You're not supposed to be out there competing with people back in Washington for being a loudmouth. You should be trying to keep the door open so that when your country, the country that you're accredited to, is doing something we don't like, you need to have the kind of access to say, look, Mr. President, this is not the direction I think you should be going. I mean, this is a problem for my government that you're doing this.
Right.
And have the kind of have earned, because all respect must be earned. You don't just get it showing up.
Sure. And
have the kind of respect that they will say, we felt we had to do this, but now we see how you look at it and we better do something else. So I just think being quietly effective rather than, in social media business is probably a better way to go. But if you're just getting one shot at it, and that's the only time you'll be ambassador because you're, coming in from some other walk of life, you might think you need to, make a big splash. Well, that often isn't what you need to be doing.
No, exactly. And that comes from perhaps just not understanding the job well enough, and people not being properly vetted. Like I remember when President Obama named a couple ambassadors and they did their hearings and they couldn't name the head of state or the head of government. And
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Because that was not only, look, I mean, you're going to get people who don't necessarily know much about the country they're going to be accredited to.
Yeah.
But my goodness, there are whole ways to start. Even as a career person, the first thing you do is the Foreign Service Institute, they put together a big program for you and get all the best experts in the country to tell you about what's going on and whether it's, you pick a stand or whatever.
Right.
And then you can say, gee, I want to learn more about that tribal situation in the southern part of the country. Do you have someone who can amplify that? Yes, we do. And right. So by the end of this process, you should be pretty good. And to
Sure.
see what happened there with a couple of people going in front of the committee and not being able to kind of deal with stuff that they should have known, that was appalling. That's just someone not doing their homework.
Yeah, and and that obviously, did that anger you? That make you upset?
Yeah, I have to admit, when you look at some of this stuff, you go, look, this is hard enough. And then you have people who just, it's kind of a lack of respect for the job they're going into, that they wouldn't learn simple things or things that you should know. So, look, all of these projects, if you think of it in school, it's not just individuals. It's all a one big giant group project. Mm-hmm. And if someone's expecting you to get an A along with everyone else and doesn't do his homework, it's pretty annoying. And that's what I saw in these ambassadors going to these European countries.
Mm-hmm. And it definitely needs to change and turn the tide there. But I know I've only got you here for a few more minutes, so just we'll try to make this a bit of a lightning round here. Why Why did President Obama choose you to be ambassador to Iraq? Because your career has been spent, in Europe and Asia, not like Ryan Crocker, your predecessor, whose whole career was in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's right. I was
because you talked about it in your book. You were surprised.
I was getting ready to leave the Foreign Service. I had really worked very hard as assistant secretary in Asia. It's a big job. And I'd done the North Korean account along with that, so double-hatted, as we say. And then Secretary Clinton called me upstairs and said some nice things, and I felt like Frodo Baggins in Lord of the Rings, that settling down in a big wing chair and thinking that's very nice. And then she said one more thing. Would you go out to Iraq? And she said, it's a big challenge. We need someone who's had big challenges, who embraces big challenges.
Right.
We need to civilianize that mission. I later found out that they were going to give it to a military person, actually a Marine, and the Army wasn't very happy with a Marine who was going to be the ambassador. So there was some backstory I would have appreciated knowing about, but whatever. So
right.
she said, we need to civilianize that mission. We need to prepare for the withdrawal of troops, and you've been in the big leagues on this, and so we want you to do that. So it was a great honor to be asked. I did not seek it out, of course.
Right.
But frankly, if you're doing your job, you shouldn't have to be seeking out your next job. It should be people who are saying, we need that guy to do this.
Right.
And by the way, you're right. It is a different area from Europe, and it's a different area from Asia, that is the Middle East. But, frankly, many of the patterns that you saw in Iraq are patterns that would be very familiar to someone who had spent some time, as I did, in the Balkans, for example. There are a lot of similarities to how the patterns work. And when you've been in a game that long, you kind of have a sense of how it works. So it's not like you're learning from zero. And frankly, when you just go to one country in your whole career, even if you spend a lot of time, you might learn a lot about that country, but you may not figure out the patterns because you have no experience seeing them elsewhere. So I felt very well prepared for it. I guess what discouraged me about Iraq was that we had many people who simply kind of tiptoed past the graveyard and never quite realized the degree to which these sectarian concerns were present. I mean, I had sure seen them in the Balkans, and who didn't really understand how that all worked and what the U.S. government could do to address it and what it could not do. I mean, I had people saying, "Oh, when are we going to get rid of that prime minister?" And I would say to them, "Well, I don't think that is our job, and it's certainly not something we could do, even if we thought we should do it. So that's something the Iraqis are going to have to figure out." And so you would deal with a lot of people who knew very little about things because they were just completely immersed in Iraq and didn't know the other, the rest of the picture in the world.
Right. That definitely could be frustrating you. It would be frustrating for anybody in any job. What was Secretary Clinton like to work for as a boss? And she was your final Secretary of State you served under.
She was. I think, trying to be helpful. I think Iraq was the biggest embassy that we had in the world, and it was a little surprising that she came once on my first day there, and I never saw her again, but neither did my successor or my successor's successor. On the other hand, I think what had happened in the Obama administration was that even though you would have expected to see a lot more of the Secretary of State, given how important the embassy was in the State Department, what ended up happening, of course, was the president asked the vice president, Joe Biden, to take a special interest in Iraq. And my goodness, I think we saw him something like 6 times altogether. So he was very engaged. So I think we had senior level attention. But normally you would have expected the Secretary of State to be more engaged.
Sure, absolutely. With the upcoming presidential election next year, if President Trump's reelected, or if one of the Democrats is elected to succeed him, and one of them were to call you and ask you to serve again and say, "Hey, we want you to be Secretary of State or Ambassador to the United Nations," what would you say?
Hey, I think I've answered just about all your questions, but on that one, I think I'm just going to say, look, I never turned down a job I have not been offered. So, yes,
Okay.
I'll listen to the offer, but that's as far as I'll go.
Okay. All right. Understand.
Yeah.
So, and I'll make this my last question, and this is sort of a domestic issue, but what do you think about what we're going to have to do to deal with this immigration issue, and how are we going to have to solve it? Because we're going to have to bring in people in Central and South America if we're going to have any kind of resolution here.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of issues that can't be adequately addressed in one place. And I think by the time you start thinking about walls, it's pretty clear you haven't thought about where this is coming from, why it's coming from, and what we need to do. So I think like a lot of issues, you need to think more constructively and in a more complex way. That is, why are people leaving Honduras?
Right.
Is that something that a bigger American effort in Honduras could address? What is going on there? What are the issues involved with Mexican law enforcement? There are a lot of issues you need to understand better, implement sort of mitigating programs, and then if you're back down to, the actual border, then you can deal with that. But I think this administration has turned it into a kind of political issue, which is to say, there are people coming in, therefore we need to build a wall.
Yeah, it's an invasion.
I think, it's, I understand people's idea that, you make these things too complex. You need to just deal with them as they happen. Well,
you're not making them complex. They are.
Yes, they make their own complexity, and I think we would do well to understand it better and to deal with it at different points. I mean, when you look at if you're down in the basement of your house and you see some water coming through your the wall in your basement, the retaining wall, you don't just put a coat of paint on it and think that's going to solve it. I mean, you've got a water problem, and you've got to figure out where it's coming from and how you can deal with it. And I think to just talk about building a wall is to turn this into a rather nasty political issue. And it's really as if to say you're not looking for consensus on it. You're just looking to take some political advantage from it. And when you look at these poor people showing up there, you know that as a country, we need to find a much better way, and we can.
Oh, if there's a will, there is a way. And I have to say, Ambassador, I haven't met too many ambassadors in my life, but you did not speak as I would expect a diplomat to. I've appreciated your candor here and your honesty and your blunt talk, and I'm pretty sure that's probably one thing that helped lead you to such a distinguished career. And I know I've kept you here for an hour, so I'm going to let you go on and get about your day. I have enjoyed it. I hope you'll come back and we can do it again. And because I'm sure we can talk about a whole lot more.
Sure. Well, my pleasure. It's been a great pleasure, and I would tell you that I think being a diplomat is not to skirt around things, but rather to try to be clear in your thoughts so that there's no misunderstanding on the other side. But being clear doesn't mean being rude.
Exactly.
And I think Americans ought to strive for more clarity and less rudeness in our discourse.
Absolutely. Well, again, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much, and look forward if you'll come back again. And best of luck to you, and thank you for your service to this nation. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you. You're very kind.
You're very welcome. And everyone, I thank you all for tuning in and watching the Free Speech Zone today. If you want to get a copy of Christopher Hill's memoir, it is called Outpost, Life on the Frontlines of American Diplomacy, still available on places like Amazon. So everyone, this has been the Free Speech Zone. I'm your host, Eric Barnard, and I'll see you next time.